Yesterday, a dataset landed on my desk that completely upends the conventional narrative of the North American trade war. It was not a press release from Ottawa or a celebratory tweet from Washington. It was a cold, hard spreadsheet from the US Travel Association, and it reveals a hidden economic architecture that most mainstream coverage has completely missed. While political analysts have spent months hyper-focusing on steel tariffs, automotive rules of origin, and agricultural retaliations, the real damage is being inflicted by an invisible army of consumers. Donald Trump initiated this conflict, intending to make Canada feel real economic pain, believing the asymmetric nature of our trading relationship gave Washington total leverage. Instead, ordinary Canadians have quietly sent the United States a receipt that absolutely nobody in Washington expected. That receipt totals $20.5 billion gone. That is not a projected figure or a theoretical model. That is the exact amount Canadian tourists spent inside the American economy annually before this conflict began. A massive capital injection that directly supported 140,000 American jobs. Before Washington decided to weaponize the border, that money flowed south every single year like clockwork. Today, it simply is not showing up anymore, period. The US Travel Association is already forecasting a catastrophic $5.7 billion shortfall in international tourism revenue directly tied to this northern border collapse. To understand how a routine trade dispute transformed into a structural realignment of the North American economy, we have to look at the precise timeline of events. This is not a coincidence. This is a sequenced political, diplomatic, and cultural reaction. Here is the timeline to keep things clear. The fuse was lit in February 2025. In a sudden, overnight decree, the Trump administration announced sweeping, across-the-board tariffs on virtually all Canadian imports. A 25% tariff hit most manufactured goods crossing the northern border, while crucial energy products were slapped with a separate 10% penalty. The strategic assumption in Washington was clear. Canada, which sends nearly 75% of its exports south, would be forced to capitulate within weeks, but Ottawa did not sit back and quietly absorb the blow. The Canadian federal government retaliated immediately, deploying a targeted $30 billion counter-tariff list aimed directly at politically sensitive American industries. Within 3 weeks, as Washington refused to back down, Ottawa escalated dramatically, expanding that retaliation list to cover $155 billion in US goods. This was no longer a minor spat between friendly integrated neighbours. This was full-blown economic warfare between two nations that moved $2.5 billion in goods across their border every single day. When you choke a daily flow of that magnitude, the friction ripples through every layer of society. Steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber were hit first, but the retaliation quickly became localized and highly aggressive. Provincial governments began using their immense market power to punish American brands. Liquor boards across multiple provinces systematically purged US alcohol from their shelves. Nova Scotia banned American liquor from government stores entirely. Ontario followed suit, stripping US brands from its massive retail network. The Northwest Territories took the extraordinary step of halting all procurement of American goods completely. This was not symbolic anger or performative politics. This was a coordinated, decentralized display of economic sovereignty. Provincial procurement policies began actively excluding American bidders from infrastructure projects. Quebec even moved to double toll costs, specifically for American commercial vehicles using its transit corridors. Every single gesture sent an unmistakable, unified message back to Washington. Canada would not accept vassal state treatment. Predictably, American consumers began feeling the sting of their own manipulations for all time. Prices on everyday consumer goods crept upward. Global auto manufacturers issued urgent warnings that integrated cross-border supply chains were fracturing. Vehicles built using parts that routinely cross the Detroit-Windsor border up to 7 times suddenly saw their production costs skyrocket. That is the brutal reality of just-in-time manufacturing in an integrated continental economy. You cannot tariff your neighbour without blowing up your own factories. Instead of a resolution, 2026 brought severe escalation. The US Commerce Department expanded its steel and aluminum tariffs dramatically wider, pushing duties to 50% across 407 distinct product categories. Suddenly, major industrial inputs like appliances, rail cars, electric vehicle components, wind turbines, and mobile cranes were caught in the crossfire. This single administrative maneuver instantly jeopardized over $200 billion in cross-border trade. Ottawa responded not with panic, but with structural defense and rapid trade diversification. The federal government injected $1.2 billion to stabilize the domestic lumber sector and deployed massive capital to stimulate internal demand for Canadian steel. Simultaneously, major Canadian rail companies agreed to slash freight rates by 50% for goods moving to domestic ports. This was Canada actively and structurally rerouting its economy away from the United States. And the data proves it is working within a 12-month window. Canada's merchandise exports to non-US countries jumped an astonishing 17%. Meanwhile, exports directly to the United States plummeted by 10%. This is a massive, historic shift in trade direction occurring in real time. Canada successfully began transferring its supply chains to Asia, Europe, and Latin America. Emerging economies like Vietnam, Taiwan, and Thailand rapidly picked up the slack, stepping into the void left by restricted American markets. The global trade picture quickly adjusted itself around Washington's new tariff walls. Global trade volumes, excluding the United States, expanded by 4.4% over the last year, nearly double the growth rate seen 12 months prior. In short, the world found a way around American protectionism. It did not stop trading. It simply stopped trading through America. But while economists were busy tracking container ships and rail cars, the most fascinating shift was happening at the individual level. When Canadian goods stopped moving south, Canadian citizens stopped moving south too. This was not triggered by an official government decree or a mandatory travel ban. This was millions of individual Canadians making a simultaneous collective decision to vote with their wallets. They simply chose to stop spending their vacation dollars inside a country that treated them as an economic adversary. The cross-border data tells this story with absolute devastating clarity. The number of Canadians taking road trips across the border dropped by 35% compared to the baseline period before tensions began. Because driving represents the most common, accessible method for cross-border travel, that 35% collapse carries immense economic weight for American small businesses. Air travel reflects the exact same reality. Canadian air arrivals in the United States fell 14% year over year in a single month alone. This is not a temporary dip or statistical noise. It is a sustained structural shift that has repeated every single month since early 2025. Statistics Canada confirmed that return trips from the US dropped 14.5% in February compared to the previous year. But when compared to the pre-tariff baseline, the collapse reaches an extraordinary 31.5%. Decades of deeply ingrained travel habits were completely broken in less than a year. This consumer strike was heavily amplified by heavy-handed border crackdowns from US immigration authorities and aggressive political rhetoric from Washington, where some commentators even mused about Canada becoming a 51st state. Canadians heard the disrespect, and they responded by rerouting their capital. Researchers at the University of Toronto tracked this phenomenon using anonymized cell phone mobility data. Their findings are staggering. Between April 2024 and March 2026, total Canadian visits to American cities dropped by 42%. Nearly half of the historical footprint of Canadian travellers in the United States has completely vanished in 24 months. This is not an affordability problem or a recession-driven retreat. Canadians did not suddenly lose their purchasing power. This is a deliberate, conscious choice rooted in national identity and political frustration. That distinction is vital for anyone analysing this trend from an investment perspective. Recessions eventually end, and spending patterns naturally recover when interest rates drop. But structural boycotts rooted in a sense of violated dignity behave differently. They possess a terrifying longevity. Saussabry to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis on these macroeconomic shifts. Because this is where the policy hits the pavement. Look at the American border communities feeling this shift first and hardest. In Montana, Canadians historically comprised 80% of all international visitors, injecting $170 million into the local economy annually. Within 10 months of the tariff announcements, border crossings plunged 19%. A single hotel in the state reported a $38,000 loss from a single Canadian sports team cancelling a 70-room booking and an associated banquet. Multiply that microeconomic event across thousands of hotels, restaurants, and gas stations along the 8,891-kilometre border. The town of Kalispell, Montana, witnessed a 25% drop in Canadian visitation, with localised credit card spending crashing by 44%. Local tourism officials have been forced to launch desperate Canadian welcome passes, offering steep discounts just to lure customers back. The story repeats from coast to coast. Washington state saw passenger vehicle crossings drop 24%, with Spokane reporting a 33% decline in tourism-related retail spending. New York, Vermont, and Michigan are experiencing significant contractions in seasonal retail employment. These states have functioned for a century as deeply integrated economic zones with their neighbouring Canadian provinces. Today, that integration is unravelling. Niagara Falls, New York, recorded 3.6 million fewer Canadian visitors over the recent travel cycle. Even major flighter destinations are bleeding capital. Las Vegas and Orlando collectively lost over 160,000 inbound flight seats originating from Canadian airports. This hits the American hospitality sector with disproportionate force because Canadian travellers are fundamentally high-value consumers. On average, they stay longer and spend more per day than domestic American tourists. Losing this specific demographic alters the entire revenue model for seasonal businesses. This brings us to the ultimate strategic contradiction of 2026. This massive financial standoff is colliding directly with the biggest sporting event in North American history, the expanded 48-team FIFA World Cup, hosted jointly by the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Initial projections by FIFA and the World Trade Organization modeled an absolute economic windfall. The tournament was expected to draw 6.5 million fans, generating a staggering $30.5 billion in economic impact for the United States alone. To secure that return, billions in public and private capital were deployed for stadium upgrades, security, and transit infrastructure, but that rosy financial forecast was built on a critical, fragile assumption. It assumed normal, frictionless, and friendly cross-border relations. It assumed millions of Canadian and Mexican fans would flood across American borders without hesitation or political baggage. Instead, two of the three co-host nations are now locked in a bitter, unresolved economic conflict. Canada is simultaneously co-hosting the tournament and executing a grassroots consumer boycott against its largest partner. The supreme irony is that the United States is attempting to stage a multi-billion-dollar festival of international unity, while its borders are effectively toxic to the very neighbours hosting the games alongside it. This tension is compounding weekly. A soaring US dollar has made travel lines exceptionally expensive for international fans, adding a severe currency penalty on top of the existing political reluctance. Simultaneously, attorneys general in New York and New Jersey have launched a sweeping investigation into FIFA's ticketing practices, alleging artificial scarcity tactics and predatory pricing that are pricing out everyday consumers. Worse still, this entire sporting spectacle is unfolding under the shadow of the ultimate economic guillotine. The formal review deadline for the USMCA trade agreement on July 1, 2026. Right in the middle of the World Cup group stage, as players compete on the pitch. Trade diplomats are locked in rooms trying to prevent the collapse of continental trade. Washington is aggressively pushing for drastically higher US-made content requirements for automobiles, a position Ottawa and Mexico City view as an existential threat to their domestic industries. Trade officials privately admit they are highly likely to miss the July 1st deadline. Missing that deadline will not instantly terminate the USMCA, but it triggers a highly destabilizing mechanism, a rolling cycle of annual reviews lasting up to a decade. This means North America is about to enter a 10-year era of permanent institutional uncertainty. Capital hates uncertainty more than it hates bad regulation. Corporations are already delaying major cross-border investments, freezing regional hiring plans, and pausing supply chain expansions. So, follow the capital, we have aggressive tariffs, heavy agricultural and industrial retaliation, an unprecedented consumer tourism boycott, and systemic long-term trade uncertainty, all converging in the exact same calendar year. Donald Trump initiated this trade war to eliminate a $46 billion good deficit and force Canada to negotiate from a position of absolute weakness. But the architecture of modern geopolitics is far too complex for simple arithmetic. By treating a highly integrated ally as an adversary, Washington has inadvertently triggered a structural shift that is draining billions of dollars out of its own domestic service economy, revitalizing Canadian domestic tourism, and forcing Ottawa to permanently anchor its trade networks in Europe and Asia. The immediate losses in American border states are quantifiable. The shortfalls in World Cup attendance are mounting, and the institutional framework of North American commerce is fracturing under the weight of permanent review cycles. Washington expected a quick, decisive surrender. Instead, they got a multi-billion-dollar economic siege. The pieces are fully set on the North American chessboard, and the economic costs are locked in. But the most consequential question remains completely unanswered. That unanswered question is whether the institutional architecture of continental trade can survive a total structural rewrite, or if the economic foundation of North America has already fractured beyond repair. To find the answer, we must strip away the political theatre, the cable news talking points, and the performative press conferences. We have to examine the cold, technical machinery of the tariffs, the retaliation matrices, and the treaty clauses that are actively reshaping supply chains from the Yukon to the Gulf Coast. This morning, we are looking directly at the hidden blueprints of this economic warfare. When Washington and Ottawa locked horns, they did not just impose taxes at the border. They unleashed a sequence of regulatory mechanisms designed to decouple two of the most integrated economies on Earth. Understanding the precise architecture of these policies reveals exactly why this crisis is structural, permanent, and highly resistant to standard diplomatic fixes. The entire crisis operates across three distinct regulatory pillars, each carefully engineered to maximize leverage and inflict targeted economic pain. First, consider the executive mechanism behind Washington's tariff offensive. The administration did not utilize traditional legislative avenues to implement these duties, knowing that a divided Congress would stall any formal trade adjustments. Instead, the White House invoked sweeping executive powers under emergency economic statutes, executing a dual-track tariff schedule that caught corporate boardrooms completely off guard. The initial 25% blanket tariff on manufactured items and the concurrent 10% levy on crude oil, natural gas and electricity relied on an expansive interpretation of national security exceptions. By labeling industrial interdependence as a vulnerability, the administration bypassed the World Trade Organization and neutralized the standard dispute settlement mechanisms embedded in existing regional pacts. The escalation to a 50% tariff tier across 407 distinct product categories represents a masterpiece of protectionist engineering. The US Commerce Department specifically isolated industrial intermediate inputs, components that are not sold directly to consumers but are vital for manufacturing final goods. By placing a 50% penalty on appliances, rail cars, electric vehicle components, wind turbines, and mobile cranes, the policy targeted the literal skeleton of modern industrial expansion. The strategic logic was simple: force multinational firms to completely abandon their Canadian supplier networks by making the cross-border acquisition of structural components financially ruinous. This administrative maneuver instantly reclassified over $200 billion in traditional imports, forcing a hard choice on companies reliant on just-in-time logistics. Second, examine the countermapping of Ottawa's $155 billion retaliation framework. The Canadian Department of Finance did not select its targets at random or out of blind frustration. Instead, trade bureaucrats utilized highly sophisticated macroeconomic modeling to build an asymmetric retaliation matrix. The architecture of the Canadian counteroffensive separates targets into distinct tiers, explicitly designed to maximize political discomfort in specific congressional districts while carefully shielding Canadian manufacturers from supply disruptions. Ottawa's list intentionally isolated consumer goods, processed agricultural products, and finished industrial machinery manufactured in regions crucial to the American administration's political base. By imposing punitive reciprocal tariffs on these specific harmonized system codes, Canada engineered an immediate domestic surplus inside the United States, forcing American producers to cut prices or lose market share entirely. Simultaneously, the provincial layer of this strategy targeted the cash flows of major American beverage and consumer conglomerates. When the liquor control boards of Ontario, Nova Scotia, and other provinces purged American alcohol brands from their retail systems, they cut off highly lucrative, high-margin revenue streams overnight. This was a calculated exploitation of state monopoly retail power to apply direct financial pressure on corporate entities that wield immense lobbying influence in Washington. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis on how these regulatory battles impact your portfolio, because these micro-level policy shifts dictate macro-level market returns. Third, look at the structural mechanics of the USMCA Article 34.7 Joint Review Clause, which functions as the ultimate ticking clock in this entire conflict. This specific statutory provision is the structural gear that transforms an acute trade dispute into a decade-long economic freeze. Under the terms of the agreement, the treaty requires a formal, comprehensive review of the entire pact every 6 years. The fast-approaching July 1, 2026 deadline is not a routine meeting, it is a mandatory institutional pivot point. According to the strict text of Article 34.7, if all 3 signatory nations do not provide unconditional, written confirmation to extend the agreement for an additional 16-year term, a mandatory annual review process triggers automatically. The technical breakdown of the current negotiations reveals why an agreement is mathematically improbable before the deadline passes. Washington is aggressively demanding a complete overhaul of the automotive rules of origin. Under the current framework, vehicles must contain 75% regional value content to cross borders duty-free. The United States is pushing to raise that threshold even higher while simultaneously demanding a massive increase in the labour value content requirement, stipulating that a larger percentage of a vehicle's components must originate in factories paying a minimum of $16 an hour in US currency. This demand is structurally unacceptable to both Ottawa and Mexico City, as it would effectively dismantle their competitive advantages in specialised parts manufacturing and assembly operations. Because trade officials fully expect to miss the July 1st deadline, the continent is transitioning into the rolling annual review mechanism. This means that for the next 10 years, the entire legal framework governing North American commerce will be subject to constant, unpredictable adjustments, revisions, and political manipulation. This structural uncertainty has completely changed the risk calculus for institutional capital. To counter the chilling effect of this perpetual review cycle, the Canadian state implemented an aggressive domestic insulation policy. The federal injection of $1.2 billion into the lumber sector and the targeted capital support for domestic steel producers function as a state-funded shield. By heavily subsidising these foundational industries, Ottawa is artificially suppressing production costs to ensure Canadian resources remain competitive globally, even when locked out of traditional American channels. Furthermore, the unprecedented 50% freight rate reduction agreed upon by major Canadian rail operators acts as a literal logistical bypass. By cutting transport costs to domestic coastlines in half, the state effectively subsidised the physical rerouting of the economy. Canadian resource wealth that previously flowed south via pipeline and railcar is now being diverted west toward the Pacific ports of Vancouver and Prince Rupert, and east toward Atlantic shipping lanes. The architecture of this deal demonstrates that Canada has abandoned the traditional strategy of appeasement and continental integration. Instead, Ottawa has engineered a legal, financial, and logistical fortress designed to withstand a prolonged period of American protectionism. The data confirms the transition is real. The 17% annual surge in merchandise exports to non-US jurisdictions proves that global markets are rapidly absorbing the supply lines that Washington attempted to choke out. The United States expected its tariff walls to fence Canada. Instead, the technical architecture of Ottawa's response has fenced America out of the newly forming global trade alliances. The entire continental economic order has been placed into an administrative centrifuge, separating decades of integrated supply chains into isolated national silos. The immediate legal and financial mechanics are fully operational, the state subsidies are deployed, and the logistical detours are already active. But as the clock ticks closer to the July 1st deadline, the true systemic breaking point is emerging in a sector that trade lawyers completely overlooked. The sudden erosion of billions in consumer travel capital, paired with the highly sophisticated insulation matrices deployed by Ottawa, demonstrates that the old playbook of unconstrained North American integration is officially dead. What began as a blunt administrative attempt by Washington to extract immediate trade concessions has triggered a multi-tiered structural divorce that neither side can easily reverse. When we step back from the immediate fiscal collateral damage, the broader strategic implications reveal an entirely new geopolitical alignment for the continent. The pre-Trump era of North American commerce was defined by an absolute, almost lazy assumption of structural permanence. Borders were viewed as mere logistical checkpoints, supply chains were hyper-optimized for geographic proximity, and political friction rarely disrupted the predictable flow of consumer capital. Today, that entire paradigm has been permanently replaced by a landscape of defensive economic sovereignty. Canada-US relations are no longer anchored by institutional trust, they are governed by tactical hedging, where every economic vulnerability must be identified, subsidized, or diversified away. This continental breakdown is fundamentally accelerating Canada's strategic integration into alternative global alliances. For over half a century, successive governments in Ottawa pursued trade diversification as an aspirational secondary policy goal, a rhetorical project that invariably yielded to the sheer gravity of the massive American market. But under the pressure of executive tariffs and rolling treaty reviews, diversification has transformed into an urgent matter of national economic survival. The 17% annual surge in Canadian merchandise exports to non-US jurisdictions is the concrete proof of a permanent structural realignment. Canada is rapidly weaving itself into the economic fabric of the Indo-Pacific and European spheres, securing binding long-term supply agreements for critical minerals, clean energy, high-tech components, and agricultural commodities with partners who value institutional stability over transactional leverage. The energy and defensive sectors are experiencing the most intense, permanent transformations within this new architecture. Historically, Canada functioned as the uncritical, secure gas station of the American industrial machine, piping its massive hydrocarbon reserves directly south with zero structural friction. Now, as the federal government heavily subsidizes the internal freight network and expands Western maritime capacity, Canada is systematically positioning itself to become a primary energy and critical raw materials anchor for the broader democratic world. By deliberately cultivating direct, state-supported shipping pipelines to markets like Japan, South Korea, and Western Europe, Ottawa is stripping Washington of its historic monopsony leverage over Canadian resources. In the defense and critical minerals arenas, this friction means Canada is no longer content to merely export unrefined ores to American processing facilities. Instead, the state is prioritizing domestic processing and manufacturing loops, ensuring that the foundational components of the next-generation economy remain under sovereign Canadian jurisdiction. This macroeconomic shift is not a temporary anomaly that will simply fade when the current political cycle concludes. Deliberate consumer strikes, structural state-funded rail subsidies, and deep changes in export geography are deeply sticky mechanisms. Once an enterprise reroutes its logistics or an individual permanently alters their travel behaviour, they do not automatically revert to old habits just because a document is signed. The entire continent has drifted away from a cooperative economic zone and into an era of managed friction, where sovereign security and defensive resilience take absolute precedence over corporate optimization. The immediate financial losses across border states and the disruption of the World Cup windfall are merely the visible symptoms of this deeper transition. The real story is that Canada has successfully called Washington's bluff, demonstrating that asymmetric dependence does not equal absolute vulnerability. By reallocating its capital, protecting its critical industrial sectors, and aggressively weaponizing its domestic consumer power, Canada has permanently altered the balance of power within North American trade relations. The pieces are now fully deployed across this multidimensional chessboard, and the immediate economic parameters are firmly set. The entire continental trade apparatus is moving rapidly toward a definitive, unyielding institutional crossroads. On July 1st, 2026, the formal review deadline for the USMCA will arrive right in the heart of the World Cup group matches, forcing all three host nations to choose between institutional extension or a 10-year cycle of permanent administrative volatility. Trade negotiators are already bracing for impact, fully expecting the deadline to pass without a comprehensive resolution. When that clock strikes midnight, the era of predictable continental commerce ends, and the true, multi-decade siege for North American economic sovereignty begins.